Well, he's going to have to cut a deal. And what he's going to try to do is convince people that it was the Iranians who wanted to go back to the negotiating table and that he's accommodating them. This is reflected in Rubio's rhetoric, which of course is rhetoric the president uses all the time. What we're saying here is that it's the Iranians who want to go back to the negotiating table. Why are they pounding on that message? It's because we want to go back to the negotiating table, but we don't want to be seen as the one that's desperate to get back to the negotiating table. Then we'll go back to the negotiating table and we'll spin whatever agreement is reached as a great victory. Trump, of course, tried to do this on June 17th, but he couldn't convince the hawks of that, and they basically pushed him to welch on the deal. This time, I think Trump's going to get a worse deal than he got on June 17th. Because again, as I said before, the Iranians have more coercive leverage the longer this war goes on. So the second time you go to the negotiating process, they're going to have more leverage. They're going to drive a tougher bargain. So he's going to have a more difficult time trying to convince people that this is not another surrender document. In other words, an even worse surrender document. But he'll try to do that. He'll try to say, we've put an end to the war. We've solved the economic crisis, and we're going to live happily ever after. Will he be able to sell that? I doubt it, but he'll try.
What it appears to me is, and as you're talking here, I'm kind of connecting some dots potentially, that maybe that is why he's saying that. That's why Rubio was saying that. But that he's like, all right, to sell that, I first have to do one more big push. And that could be the reason why Jack Keane said this.
We are on a definite path to return to major combat operations that would involve Israel and the United States. I think that is the path we're on. Is there some negotiations that the Iranians want to do here? Of course. They want to negotiate. Why now? They want to negotiate because they want to stop the United States from imposing their will by firing on them and taking away their military capabilities. They want to stop that, as they did successfully back on April the 7th and April the 8th. They want to replay that. I don't believe that's going to happen. Pakistanis and Qataris are supporting him on that, but I don't think that's where the president is and his team around him. I believe where they are frustrated, they want to get the Straits of Hormuz eventually open and also return to major combat operations and finish what they started out to do in terms of assigned military objectives.
Now, you pointed out a second ago, I don't have to ask you the same question twice, all these expansive list of objectives and things Jack Keane thinks we can accomplish. He doesn't ever provide a path to how we're going to get that done when it all failed during the first phase of this war, which you so clearly articulated last time with the 40-day bombing phase, the blockade phase, and then the MOU phase, and now then we're trying to find a new phase, I guess. But do you think that it's possible that President Trump is putting out stuff like this, and like what Greenway said, and like what Keith Kellogg said also, that we want to try one more big push, and then we can somehow claim after the smoke clears that we caused Iran to make a deal?
Could be the case, Danny. I wouldn't be surprised. They're desperate, and they're looking. I think they're looking for a way to end this war, yet be able to spin a story that we prevailed, the Iranians didn't prevail. And you could make an argument that what they're trying to do, and I'm not saying there's a lot of hard evidence to support this. This is, based on deduction by you and me. You could make a case that they're setting up a story that says that it's the Iranians who want to go back to the negotiating table. They're desperate. Enormous damage has been done to them. And then what we do is we go out and we slam them over the next couple days. And then we, in effect, declare victory and say we're ready now to go back to the negotiating table. And we hope that the Iranians feel the time is here to negotiate another memorandum of understanding. And then that's that deal is done, and then we say it's not a surrender document. We actually prevailed, and the reason we prevailed is we got tough with the Iranians, and we were probably overly patient, but nevertheless, we, in the end, brought down the hammer on them, and they conceded. I mean, that's a plausible way of getting out of it from their perspective. The question is whether they can convince the rest of us that this is what really happened. And I think that's going to be almost impossible to do. They'll try to tell a story that we won, but I don't think that you can tell that story. I mean, when you go down what the list of demands were going into this war, and the fact that we didn't achieve any of them, and then you look at the other downsides that have resulted from this war, what the world looked like on February 27th compared to today. Forget the demands we made, just who controls the Strait of Hormuz, what's happened to our basing structure in the Gulf, what's happened to our alliance structure in the Gulf, what's happened to our munitions supply, and so forth and so on. This is really a devastating defeat for the United States. How can anybody miss that? But they'll try to spin a story, assuming we're correct in what they're up to, that portrays us as the winners and the Iranians as the losers.
And, I have to wonder. So we had the deal that you say Trump needs to try to get now in our hands with the MOU. So in June, President Trump made the statements that you just articulated a second ago. He acknowledged, he recognizing the potential. None of those things have changed. They're all there now. And yet, for some reason, he still gummed it up with this, trying to change the terms in the southern part of the Strait of Hormuz with the Omani corridor. Then now this 12 straight days we've attacked them, et cetera. Probably a 13th day is coming later today. Maybe something even bigger. We'll see what's going to happen. But let's say that he does do what we have just speculated he may, and then after some big hit or whatever, claim we're going to walk away. We'll be in a worse position on the other side of all this if Iran agrees to anything. And what's to say he's not going to do it again and gum that one up? I mean, why would he abide by over there with worse terms than he did on June 17th with the terms he had?
Problem that he faces is that the munitions crisis and the situation with regard to oil prices is reaching the point where he just has to reach some sort of agreement that he sticks to. He just can't keep doing this. I don't think he can fight a forever war here. If you think about Afghanistan, you think about Iraq, you think about Vietnam, think about those forever wars. The international economy was not affected in any meaningful way as a result of those wars. We weren't talking about taking the international economy off a cliff during the Afghanistan war. And in terms of munitions, none of those conflicts really ate up precious American munitions the way the Iran war is doing. So this is a very different situation, and he has to shut this one down. And by the way, we haven't even talked about the midterm elections, which really do matter to him, and which this war has consequences for. You showed the poll data before about what's happening to his support inside the MAGA movement, and this is not good news for the president when it comes to the midterm elections. So that matters too. So this one, I think, has to be shut down at some point in time, and I just don't think it can go on and on.
And it's not a surprise. But the administration is sabotaging its own potential. If they were going down that path, then they would be saying things that are different, that are supportive of that. But instead, in Senate testimony, here is Pete Hegseth talking about how weak the Iranian side is.
Iran is at the weakest point militarily it has ever been in the past decade. Certainly, maybe in 47 years, as they've gathered effectively a terror army. So I acknowledge they still have capabilities, no doubt. But the amount of damage that we've done to them over the course of these series of operations has put them in the worst place they've ever been.
How can you make that argument in the worst place they've ever been when we just showed you this just the last few days? They keep hitting this stuff. I mean, how can anyone plausibly make that statement? I mean, how does anybody believe?
Well, I would just note that what's been happening since the tit for tat strategy started on July 7th is that the Iranians have been targeting all of our military installations in the Gulf, and they have been destroying them. And we, therefore, have retreated in very important ways to Jordan. And the reason that Jordan has become a target, remember early in the war, Jordan was not a target at all. The target set that the Iranians were going after was exclusively in the Persian Gulf. Well, now Jordan is a big fat target for the Iranians. Why is that the case? Because we're moving our military capability out of the Gulf to Jordan. And now the Iranians are basically going after our military capabilities and our infrastructure in Jordan and forcing us back to Israel. And at the same time, there's no evidence they're running out of missiles and drones. So how somebody like Pete Hegseth can argue that the Iranians are weaker than ever and we have them right where we want them is an argument I just don't understand how he can make. It's just palpably untrue. It's obvious from what's going on that the Iranians are in an excellent position from a military point of view, and that we have no way of eliminating their military capability. And by the way, Danny, it's also important to emphasize that the Russians and the Chinese are clearly helping them. I think not only with intelligence, but also with weaponry. I believe that the Iranians are receiving help from the Chinese and the Russians that's making their weapons much more deadly. And that's causing us huge problems. So I think that Hegseth here is just blowing smoke.
Yeah, I mean, that's kind of those chickens coming home to roost, which we've been doing against Russia for all these years. And, I know you have some views on this in China, but, given all these weapons to Taiwan all this time, it's not surprising that they're going to both do something against us. Actually, the only thing I've been surprised at is that it's taken this long for them to get to it, especially the Russians. Speaking of the Russians, there was Marco Rubio met with Sergei Lavrov yesterday. And interestingly, the readout on the American side was merely that a meeting took place and that they talked about the Russia-Ukraine war. That's it. No, it was like 2 sentences long, very short. But on the Russian side, Dmitry Peskov was asked this morning how the Russians view that.
In this situation, I wouldn't be overly optimistic. Contacts are indeed taking place. That is always positive. But one cannot speak of any new dynamics or acceleration right now. We continue our dialogue with the Americans through existing working channels, and we hope that when the American negotiators are freer, we will continue in-person communication.
Very good news.
They will be able to come to Moscow and continue our dialogue.
The Russians have said of late, Sergei Lavrov and Vladimir Putin both, that they are very disappointed that the spirit of Anchorage from Trump's the first time when he had rolled out the red carpet is effectively dead, and there's nothing more to it. So why do you suppose that Sergei Lavrov would agree to meet Rubio, and what do they actually expect to happen?
I think that he met with him because he wants to show that he is a responsible diplomat who's open to diplomacy. He's willing to meet with the American Secretary of State. This all shows that Russia is a responsible actor, responsible stakeholder in the international system. But in terms of actually expecting anything from the Americans, the Russians at this point in time don't expect anything from the Americans. They know that you can't trust Marco Rubio or President Trump any further than you can throw them. These are people who speak out of both sides of the mouth, who reach agreements and then violate those agreements.
Wow.
Russians understand that they're basically at war with the United States, and what they have to do is go to great lengths to make sure that the United States loses in Iran. That's in Russia's interest. And furthermore, that Russia wins in the Ukraine war, and that Russia delivers the United States twin defeats. This is what the Russians are thinking, for sure.
Incredible.
You want to remember, Danny, that at the G7 meetings that President Trump attended in France, the members of the G7 said afterwards in a declaration that they were going to accelerate their assistance to Ukraine in its waging of the long-range drone campaign against Russia. And furthermore, they made it explicit in the declaration that they were going to ramp up efforts to damage the Russian economy. This is the G7 countries, including the United States of America. Then you had in early July the NATO meetings at Ankara. And again, President Trump was there. And again, he and the NATO allies made it clear that they still had their gun sights on Russia, and they were going to do everything they could to make sure that Ukraine lost, that Russia lost in the Ukraine war, and would hopefully be weakened to the point where it was knocked out of the ranks of the great powers. This is what the United States is up to. Despite what President Trump or Marco Rubio says from time to time, it's quite clear that we have our gun sights on the Russians, and the Russians fully understand that, and they will act accordingly, which is not to say that you won't get this occasional diplo speak from people like Sergei Lavrov, because this kind of soft power is in Russia's advantage.
And speaking of the war there, because I think it's the most likely outcome is going to be the literal inverse of what you said the U.S. had hoped to do, which was to knock Russia out of the power, out of the ranks of the great powers. We may end up knocking ourselves out. But I want to look at something more on the operational, not the granular level so far. So far up to this point, but there has been over the last month or so, one of the major themes in the Western media was been a turning point has been achieved. Now then, because of these long range strikes and like into the wild berries, they're basically their Amazon supply chains, whatever, big, huge, spectacular fires, black smoke everywhere, refineries being hit, other military targets deep inside of Russia, and apparently Russia is not able to stop them. That's the implication. So a turning point has been reached. But then here in just the last week or 10 days, we saw that all of a sudden Ukraine has fired their prime minister, they fired their defense minister, and now they fired their general commander, General Sirski. So what do you make of all these turnovers? Because if you're winning, seems like that would be a bad time to overturn these key players.
Yeah, it's hard to disagree with that. When you see Sirski and the defense minister both fired, you just sort of say to yourself, wow, you don't want to do this in the middle of a war unless you absolutely have to. My sense as to what was happening here is that there was a fight between the defense minister and Sirski that involved strategy for the war. When the defense minister was appointed about 6 months ago, he more or less had two missions. One was to deal with the manpower problem. As we both know, the Ukrainians have a huge manpower problem. They have so many draft dodgers and so many people who are at the wall that they just don't have enough fighting forces up on the front lines. And the new defense minister was supposed to solve that problem. And in addition, he was going to go to work on the long-range drone attacks against Ukraine, against Mother Russia. Now, what happened is that he did not solve the manpower problem. The manpower problem is worse than ever. In fact, the last time I was on the show, I believe you showed some clips of riots in the western part of Ukraine, in the city of Lvov. So the defense minister did not solve that problem, and that causes problems for Sirski because he needs increased numbers of troops. The other thing is, I think that there is a tension between waging a long-range drone war deep into Russia on one hand, and number two, employing large numbers of drones on the front lines. And I think the emphasis on using long-range drones that the defense minister favored was causing problems for Sierski up on the front lines. So Sierski was facing two problems. One, he wasn't getting enough troops. The manpower problem wasn't coming close to being solved. And number two, I think that you have a finite number of drones, and he was having trouble getting his fair share of those drones because there was so much interest in the long-range drone campaign. And I think those sort of strategic or military considerations caused lots of tension between the two of them.
Very good.
They had two different strategies in mind on how to wage the war. One emphasized the long-range drone program, and the other, or long-range drone campaign, and the other fighting up on the front lines. And I think that led
Please
to
subscribe
significant
to my
tensions
channel.
between the two of them. They might not have liked each other on personal grounds anyway, and you got a real conflict going here. And Zelensky ended up in a situation where he had to fire both of them. He fired the defense chief first, but that caused all sorts of protests because people really liked
Like
the
and share
defense chief.
this video.
And I think that's in large part because they thought the long-range drone campaign was a winning strategy. And furthermore, it did not involve Ukrainian casualties. Whereas Sierski, because he's up on the front lines and huge numbers
This
of people,
video
huge numbers of
is very
Ukrainians are being
important.
killed on the front lines, he's not going to be very popular compared to the defense minister. So I think in the end, Zelensky really ended up in a situation where he had no choice but to fire both of them. And this is not a good situation.
It's not a good situation, and I think as we have both concluded, it's not going to make any difference who is in those positions, and whoever they replace them with, it's not going to be any more successful. In the last bit of time we have here, I wonder if you can
open your TV
tell us
and go to my channel for
collusion,
fresh
I guess,
news.
between these two, or the nexus between these two wars in the Middle East and here, and what the impact on what we've discussed earlier on the Iran war could have here. Because if Zelensky has been begging, he wants a Patriot interceptor, a factory built there. He said they're going to do something that's years down the road. But they're at war right now. They're already having, again, to look at what's going to happen energy-wise for the winter, and are they going to be able to survive that again? But now that there's going to be even fewer air defense missiles available because we're burning through them at all. We're not going to have any to give to them at all, and maybe not even any of the longer range missiles, et cetera. And with the price of oil going up and the price of everything concurrently going up as well, we're going to be focused on trying to get that solved. What impact is that going to have on the actual conduct of this war?
Well, I'm basically from the Ted Postal school when it comes to talking and thinking about defensive missiles. I'm not sure those Patriots were doing much anyway. I mean, the implication of the discourse about the Patriots is that if the Ukrainians were able to get their hands on large numbers of Patriots, they'd be able to shoot down the vast number of ballistic missiles and cruise missiles and drones that the Russians are targeting Ukraine with. I actually don't believe that. But it's irrelevant because the fact is we don't have Patriot missiles to give to the Ukrainians. So they're not going to get the Patriot missiles, and there are no real meaningful substitutes here. So what you see if you look at what's going on in Ukraine now is that the Russians are pretty much free to attack any target in Ukraine, and they don't have to worry at all about a Patriot missile or any other kind of missile knocking down the incoming missiles or the incoming drones. So what you see is that Ukraine is highly vulnerable, and the Russians have a huge inventory of bombs and missiles and drones, and they are really pounding Ukraine. And I think most importantly, at this point in time, is the campaign in Odessa. And it looks to me like the Russians have basically cut off Odessa as a port of exit for Ukraine. Ukraine sells lots of its grain and wheat through Odessa, but that's no longer possible because the Russians have done so much damage to the port in Odessa. And I think what's happening here, and is going to continue to happen, is that the Russians are going to use their massive advantage in air power to continue to pound Ukraine. And this, coupled with the trouble that Ukraine is having on the battlefield because of its lack of manpower, I think guarantees that the Russians are going to win this war, number one. And number two, that Ukraine is going to emerge as a dysfunctional rump state.
Yeah.
So this is all disastrous for the Ukrainians.
And so let me ask you in like 30 seconds or less, what about the economics? Because everything in Ukraine is only kept alive because of European money. But with the disaster going on in the Gulf and the rising of the cost of energy, Russia's now getting more flush with cash because of the rise of that. And it's costing more to do business in Europe, and they're already pretty weak economically. Do you see any concerns about that in terms of how they can support going forward Ukraine?
Well, I think there's no question that what's happening in Iran is going to have a seriously negative effect on the price of oil and gas in Europe and cause big trouble for those economies. And I think the politics in Europe are likely to change over time and erode support for Ukraine in some important ways. And this means that Ukraine will get less help from Europe over time. You can already see evidence of that happening. And by the way, in terms of material support, this has already happened with the United States. So I think events in Iran and just the course of the war between Ukraine and Russia is creating a situation where Ukraine's future looks highly bleak.